Okay, we're back. So today we'll kind of finish up the New Deal and start moving into Roosevelt's foreign policy, talk about the good neighbor policy, isolationism, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Hirohito, the rise of the Axis powers, the beginnings of World War II, the Lend-Lease Bill, Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, and Pearl Harbor. Any questions, any of that? Okay. So, Roosevelt's reelected by a landslide in 1936. Except New Deal programs were largely maintained, some slightly expanded, but Roosevelt's second term was somewhat lackluster. It didn't get as much accomplished in his second term as it did in his first. Except the Fair Labor Standards Act probably was the biggest accomplishment of the second term. The setting down such standards as 40-hour work week, minimum wage, end of child labor, things like that. It's an impressive bill in itself, but more and more Roosevelt's looking towards foreign policy, but there were some issues at home he's dealing with, particularly the Supreme Court. That makes in the news right now because there's a Supreme Court vacancy, but the Supreme Court had become a political issue during Roosevelt's administration because so many of these justices had stepped out and taken political opinions, saying that how much they disliked Franklin Roosevelt, how much they disapproved of him. Several important New Deal programs have been struck down to be replaced by other issues later. So Roosevelt's stuck with a fairly conservative Supreme Court that is not really much interested in Roosevelt's efforts to rescue the nation from the Great Depression. The Supreme Court justice got a job for life, so they don't have to worry about unemployment anytime soon. Well, for example, one justice had planned to retire in 1932, but remained because he felt that Roosevelt was unfit for the presidency. And he had a Supreme Court that was just determined to undermine the Great Depression in spite of its obvious successes in stabilizing the country, reducing unemployment, and rescuing the nation's financial and economic infrastructure. So in 1937, Roosevelt announced a thing called the court packing scheme. As were ordinarily, you would have most presidents by this time would have been able to appoint one or even two Supreme Court justices. Justices sitting on the Supreme Court were saying they weren't going anywhere anytime soon because how much they disliked Roosevelt. So Roosevelt decided to strike back. Now remember, the Supreme Court is established in the Constitution, but it's kind of vague what constitutes the Supreme Court. That's really was up to Congress. Congress, by statute, names how many Supreme Court justices there could be. There have been as few as 6 and as many as 11, but mostly the number has been around 9. The qualifications of Supreme Court justices determined by Congress. Basically, they can be anybody, they can serve any amount of time, but the tradition has been federal judges serve for their entire lives. Let's say no retirement age or anything, no term limits. But the Constitution is very clear about how Supreme Court justices are chosen. You see, the President nominates Supreme Court justices and all federal judges. And it's the job of the Senate to give its advice and consent. That is, the President sends up the nominations, the Senate's job is to consider it, take a vote on it, and then that justice is confirmed. But now there are a few ways around that. For example, they have what we call a recess appointment. That is, Congress is not in session in a particular position needs to be filled, then the president can just appoint a justice or judge on his own. Been known to happen before. Cabinet appointments, masterships, and things like that. But there are two key points of the process. The President of the United States is not limited on what times he can appoint judges. All there has to be is just a vacancy. The President can issue an appointment any time from the moment he's inaugurated until the time his successor is nominated. There's no such thing as this idea that the President doesn't get to appoint someone in the last year in office. There have been presidents who have appointed judges and Supreme Court justices up to the hours before he left office. Probably the most interesting case was John Adams, what they called the Midnight Judges in 1801. The last night he was in office, John Adams was signing appointments for federal judges and Supreme Court justices. Nothing in the Constitution said he couldn't do that. But the Senate's job is, whether they like the President or not, they still have a job to do and to keep the judiciary filled. Because you're going to have three branches of government and have the checks and balances set up in the Constitution. You have to have a fully staffed judiciary, whether you like it or not. Now, just as there is not some idea that the President can't appoint somebody in his last office, there's not a similar idea that senators that don't have to do their job with their last year in office. There have been Supreme Court justices appointed in election years since the country began. Like they say, elections have consequences. Who gets to choose a Supreme Court justice in 2016? The American people decided that in the election in 2012. Now, does Congress determine the size of the Supreme Court? Yes. But they do that by statute, not by vacancy. They have to change the law saying who is appointed, when, and how many. It's like they say, facts are pesky things. Well, here's what happens is Roosevelt in 1937 is bound and determined he is not going to have the Supreme Court overturn every one of his New Deal programs. But his most ardent critics are Supreme Court justices over the age of 70. Or being 70 years old isn't a big deal so much in 2016, but it's Methuselah old by the standards of 1937. So here's what happens. There's a court packing scheme in 1937. FDR announces a plan to appoint up to 6 new justices to the Supreme Court. One for each member over 70. And retirement age is 70 for all justices after that. See, they can't just arbitrarily change when someone's going to be in a court. That is, you're appointed for life. They can't come around and pass a law later saying, "Oh, it's not going to be for life anymore." Like right now, there are about 4 Supreme Court justices over the age of 70 right now. The oldest is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's 82. Well, immediately, sharp opposition arose over what can be called the court packing plan. A lot of people felt that the Supreme Court should not be politicized like this, that justices should be appointed on their own merits, that the the number of Supreme Court justices should not be tampered with for ideological reasons. And the traditional idea of a appointment for life should not be changed either. So as a result, it's opened up a lot of deep fissures in the Democratic Party. Up to about 1937, Democrats of all stripes, the conservative wing, moderate, and the liberal wing, pretty much all been behind Roosevelt on everything. But after this point, conservative Democrats, mostly in the South, turned against Roosevelt and began allying with Northern Republicans to block further New Deal reforms. So after the 1938 elections, midterm elections, Democrats lost a bunch of seats in the Congress, and the New Deal was effectively over. But the Supreme Court kind of read the writing on the wall, kind of softened its attitudes against Roosevelt, and approved such things as the National Labor Standards Act and the Social Security Act. Those were upheld by the Supreme Court. And suddenly Supreme Court justices started retiring. Between 1937 and 1943, FDR appointed 9 new justices. There's almost an entirely full slate except for a Hoover nominee who retired in 1945 after Roosevelt died. Because one of his own appointments stepped down and he reappointed someone else. So that's the Supreme Court. Well, take a look at the good neighbor policy. This is Roosevelt's Latin American policy. You may remember Theodore Roosevelt, the Roosevelt Corollary, the Monroe Doctrine, William Howard Taft's dollar diplomacy. It's early 1900s, 19-teens, even in the 1920s, there's a lot of American interventionism in Latin America, particularly in areas of the Caribbean and Central America. The United States tried to exert its influence, so it actively went in, stepped in, prevented coups, staged coups, overthrew governments, and sent in troops for long occupations in different countries. But as the United States, one of these little countries, do what the United States wanted them to do, so the U.S. stepped in quite often. In fact, go back here in your book. Anyway, back here deeper in the book, page 705, you'll see it. See this map of all these different countries showing where the United States had sent in troops, had intervened, even occupied these countries for long periods of time. Dominican Republic occupied for 8 years between 1916 and 1924. Haiti occupied for almost 20 years. Cuba occupied on several occasions. Nicaragua, among many others. And the worst part for a lot of these Latin American countries was, even though they're independent, because their governments were putting forward policies that were opposed to American corporate interests in those countries, they'd often find that their freely elected democratic governments were being overthrown in favor of military dictatorships. In a lot of cases, it ended up sparking long civil wars in this country. Now, this is something even continued after World War II. In 1956, the United States overthrew the elected democratic government in Guatemala. That sparked a civil war that lasted for 30 years. But Roosevelt, here in the 1930s, he's hoping to reverse that trend, reverse that policy, try to encourage better relations between the United States and Latin America and Caribbean region. That instead of trying to force these countries to do America's bidding at gunpoint, to try a cooperative relationship, like neighbors, like people who respect each other. So by the time Roosevelt took office in 1933, relations were slowly improving in Latin America, but the Great Depression had crippled trade. That is, America didn't have any money to buy anything, and neither from Latin America, and Latin America didn't have any money to buy anything from the United States. So in 1933, U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, former congressman from Kentucky, Hull signed a pledge of non-intervention in 1933 between the United States and the nations of Latin America, basically stating the United States is not going to go in and overthrow somebody's government. Furthermore, the United States renounced its right to intervene in Cuban affairs. That is, the Platt Amendment the U.S. had forced on the Cuban Constitution. The United States renounced that, saying it's not going to force Cuba to do exactly everything it wanted to do. And except for American bases in Panama and Cuba, all American troops were withdrawn from Latin American countries by 1936. A real test came in 1938 with Mexico attempting to nationalize its oil holdings. As Mexico is a large oil-producing country. The problem was American oil companies are going in and pumping out as much oil as they could, sending it back to the United States, and for all its wealth, Mexico not seeing a dime of it. So to change that, Mexico declared that all oil and natural resources belong to Mexico, and took over production of all oil in Mexico. Refining, production, distribution, all owned by the government, creating a company called Pemex. This caused a real problem because that is millions upon millions of dollars American corporations have invested in Mexican oil production. Now, under ordinary circumstances, before Roosevelt, what would happen in this kind of case? Some country decides to take over an American company in a foreign country. What would happen in this case? It's send in the army. America would take over the government, seize control, return control of the oil, whatever company, back to the original American owners, and that country would be stuck with a dictatorship for a while. But instead, Roosevelt does something completely different. Instead of sending in the Marines, the Army, or somebody else to take over the country, what they do is negotiate. Sit down and talk, like neighbors would do. Try to hash it out. So as a result of this, Mexico agrees to a settlement with American oil companies, help recover their losses, which deal is finalized by 1941. So they set up a war in Mexico against the United States. A nice settlement between gentlemen. Now, go back to Europe. Now, World War I had destroyed the economy of Europe, making the 1920s a very difficult and unstable decade. Governments across the continent are being overthrown, nations experimenting both with socialist and fascist governments. As the desperation is pulling these countries to further and further extremes. People wanted immediate action, but in some cases these countries were too debt-ridden or too bogged down by internal divisions to take any kind of significant action. So what ended up happening is these countries had their governments overthrown, or more extremist groups got thrown into their legislatures and parliaments, pulling them either to the extreme left or the extreme right. In my direction. So again, the Great Depression, that hits Europe especially hard. They really hadn't recovered from the 1920s then. So the economic political situation in Europe is growing even worse. Now the Allies, particularly France, had hoped to finance their war debts through German reparations. That is, Germany in the Treaty of Versailles had to pay for World War I. So the China shop rule, you break it, you buy it. So the problem with that was the German economy collapsed. They don't have a dime of their name anymore. They can't send out any reparations because they don't have any money. So it meant France didn't have any money coming in from Germany. They couldn't pay back the people they owe money to. As a result, at one point, 1923, the French had gone and occupied an area called the Ruhr Valley. French sent in their army into this heavy mining and industrial area, basically trying to use whatever was being produced in that area to help finance their war debts, but end up resulting in massive strikes by the German workers, and France getting little of anything. Now, the German economy is reeling under the weight of reparations, and the very fragile government it was being governed by, called the Weimar Republic, as Germany for the overthrow of its government to overthrow the Kaiser to rise of Hitler. Call it Weimar because that's the city in which they signed that new constitution. The Weimar Republic was always seemed to be on the brink of collapse. See, Germany in the 1920s, in terms of civil liberty, is actually one of the most liberal countries in Europe. You have absolute freedom of speech, press, religion, due process of law. You have an in-depth social safety net. That is, you have old age pensions, you have workers' comp, you have national health insurance. The thing they didn't have in the Great Depression was jobs. But the 1920s, though, the German economy completely disintegrated. Came across a problem called hyperinflation. Now, it's different from regular inflation. You know, inflation's a problem of a value of money increasing, but prices going up. I'd say hyperinflation is inflation on steroids. Value of the currency disintegrating and prices skyrocketing.
And so take a milk out of the money and go out with it.
Oh yeah. Like say, and worse is about 1924, 1925. It took about a billion marks to buy a loaf of bread. It's a billion of their dollars to buy a loaf of bread, which would have been 10 cents in the United States. Billy said it would take a wheelbarrow full of money to. But basically, German mint just kept running the printing presses, running off higher and higher denominations of money. German housewives would have to run to the store early in the day, try to get the goods they needed because prices were rising so fast that if they waited at the end of the day, Like I said, their cousins' paychecks would have been able to cover it. German school children at one point were given 100,000 mark notes and scratch paper. So how do you like to be handed a $100,000 bill and say, here it's drawn and it's worthless? It wasn't even worth the paper it's printed on. So you've got hyperinflation, you've got the humiliation of the loss of World War I, loss of its national prestige, economy collapse. Plus you have another problem here in the Weimar Republic, something called proportional representation. Now in the United States you have, the system is whoever gets the most number of votes in an election wins. Like I said, no points for second place. But in the German system, the system of proportional representation, you do have points for second place. Even though you're rejected by the people, by the majority of the people, you still get a seat at the table. For example, in an area, instead of just having a system of one man, one vote, you have one district, and you have a person with most number of votes wins in that district only. You have a larger district, and you have, say, 10 seats, or in order to cover, say, 10 districts. So, the most popular party gets, say, 60% of the vote, they get 6 seats. Person comes in second, that party gets, say, 20% of the vote, they get 2 seats. Another one gets another seat because his party got 10%. Steadily and still is further divided. So even though you may have been rejected by 90% of the voters, you still get a seat in the Reichstag, or the regional legislatures. So as a result of that proportional representation system, there was absolutely no reason for people to work together. No reason at all for people to build broad coalitions across party into different interest groups, because those interest groups just form their own political party, and they're at the table anyway, pushing their own agenda. But that also means, because you say 5 or 10%, get 5% of the vote, you automatically get a seat in the legislature or the Reichstag. The more extremist groups get a voice, even though they have been overwhelmingly rejected by the people. So as a result of that, Adolf Hitler said we get a foothold in German politics and begin his rise to power. Now, it started off with the fascism in other parts of Europe, particularly starting with Italy. Benito Mussolini. Italy, he had his fascist party come to power in 1922. It said he promised to make the trains run on time because of budget problems for delays and inefficiency, labor strikes. What he ended up doing was basically banning reporting of train arrivals. That simply made it illegal to report bad things about what's happening in the government of the country. Took away freedom of the press and freedom of speech. Didn't actually do anything. And so Mussolini comes to power by basically threatening to have his the fascist party's paramilitary wing, the black shirts, because of the distinctive black uniforms they wore. Mussolini promised to be the king of Italy, that if he was not made premier, that is, the prime minister of Italy, the black shirts would march on Rome and probably overthrow the government. So the king gives in and makes him premier. Basically, gives him power anyway. So what happens with the rise of fascism in Europe is it rises to power on brute force. None of the fascist governments in Europe in the 1930s, 1940s were ever elected. They seized power or had it handed to them. So Mussolini and other fascist regimes rose power, brute force, contempt for democracy and intellectuals, just about anyone else, and calling for renewal of national prestige. These are extreme reactions. That is, Mussolini came to power promising that he's going to restore the Roman Empire. That he's going to be the great force in Europe it was 1,000 years before. But basically he's trying to create this mythic past, trying to take Italy back to a time that, there's a Roman Empire, but they're trying to promise a time that never happened. That everything's great and wonderful when this happened. It wasn't the case. Remember, reactionary by definition is someone who wants to take the country back to a particular period of time. They're looking backwards. On top of that, they have just contempt for the democratic process. That is, they do not like elections. They don't like having certain people vote. They'll make it almost impossible for certain people to vote, either ethnic minorities or women. And eventually they'll just scrap the vote altogether once they're in power. Contempt for intellectuals, that is, people with an education, because they can discern fact from the political fiction the party's handing out. Which is why when fascist regimes come to power, folks like us are always the first target. That is, people in college classrooms, professors, because we're willing to speak truth to power. We know the facts. We know the system is not, their system is not going to work. I'd say a lot of these fascist groups encourage violence against people they don't agree with. Say a protester comes to a rally, they would beat them to a bloody pulp. Or they take people and they just, they don't like a particular religious group or ethnic group or political party. They'll just send the party thugs over to burn down a church, threaten someone, or vandalize someone's political party headquarters. If Mussolini thought about organized labor, he had the black shirts go in and physically break up strikes. This is even before he came to power. That basically they went in with guns and 2x4s and beat those strikers. Now in Germany, the Weimar Republic was set by weak leadership and an array of about 24 different political parties. There was no unity among any particular political wing of the government. That is, everybody's fighting among themselves. No one's willing to work together. That is, having a system of two political parties in the United States, two major political parties, where each one's trying to get the majority of the voters. Just when you have 24 political parties, you're never going to have that. And essentially, if people may agree on about 90 or 95% of things otherwise, they may be trying to undermine a competing party because they don't like the guy who's in charge, or they just want to knock him down a few notches. Even it might be some guy like this who's picking up the slack in the meantime. So, in such a hotly divided atmosphere, it's easy for a small fringe group to start achieving a great deal of influence, very small groups of supporters. Strikes had crippled Germany. Many longed for a return to national prestige. Some wanting revenge against Germany's enemies from World War I, those outside the country and those imaginary enemies within the country. And to many in Germany, Hitler offered that promise of order and the revenge and the restoration of prestige, but Many others he simply buffooned. There were some people who did admire Hitler. He had this very over-dramatic speaking style, and a lot of people were attracted to that. But it was only because he was telling them what they were wanting to hear. A lot of people who didn't like him and didn't like what he wanted to hear, they made fun of him all the time. Made fun of his speaking style. Said, "Oh, who would take him seriously?" The president of Germany at the time, a man named Paul von Hindenburg, who had been a hero in World War I, yeah, they named the blimp that exploded after him. Hindenburg simply dismissed corporals and called him a little corporal, because Hitler's ranked in World War I. As a little corporal, so at it again.
So he was the German what?
He is the president of Germany, in the late 1920s and early 1930s. So, essentially for those fringe groups and those desperate in Germany in the 1920s, 1930s, and there were a lot of them, Hitler basically gave everybody what they wanted. Gave different groups that one target they're wanting to look down. Made the problems even worse is you actually have some prominent Americans and American corporations helping finance Hitler's rise to power. Give an example, Henry Ford, notoriously anti-Semitic. He made a good car, he hated Jews. Gave a bunch of money to Hitler, and Hitler actually kept a full-length portrait of Ford in his office. The Chase National Bank, later Chase Manhattan Bank, was loaning Hitler money well into the mid to late 1930s. They even had a lot of Nazi sympathizers in the United States. Groups called the Bund. Openly holding rallies, marching around their own little brown Nazi-like uniforms, like Hitler's brown shirts in Germany. Openly saying that they need to have a guy like Hitler running America. I can tell you just how bad the Depression hit Germany. At its worst point in 1932 in the United States, unemployment hit 25%. Mexico, not nearly as industrialized, unemployment hit a peak of that 10%. Bad enough, but not nearly as bad as it was in the United States. Great Britain, unemployment was at 25%. They were able to barely hold on because the different political parties in Britain were working together to solve the problems. And radically different solutions, but the king made them all work together, because no one could get a majority. 1932, German unemployment, 40%. Economy had completely collapsed. The Weimar Republic could not function. People are desperate, wanting something, anything to solve the problem of the Depression. They're bankrupt, they're desperate, clinging to someone, anyone who promises them a way out. They're tired of the strikes, the near riots. They're tired of the extremism, tired of the rising crime in the country. They became increasingly desperate. Tired of the corruption and gridlock in the German Reichstag, that is their parliament. They want somebody to come forward with a solution. So, the government by 1933 is taking the move of banning some of the more violent political groups. And some of these extremist groups in Germany, they were staging very violent strikes and demonstrations. even attacks on opposition politicians. So the German government gave itself the power to ban certain political groups, starting to restrict some political freedoms. So this is the environment you have here, the late 1920s, early 1930s in Germany. It's a sheet showing you the breakdown of political parties in the German Reichstag. There's a handful of political parties, among those who actually do have any type of influence in Germany. The abbreviations here are the German political party abbreviations. NSDAP, in Germany's National Socialist Deutsches Arbeiterparty, National Socialist German Workers' Party. It's in German. And so the first two letters of the party's abbreviation was the National Socialist, NS, where you get Nazi from. As you can see here from the chart here, just the different extremes which German politics is being taken to. 1928, the Nazis only have 12 seats in the Reichstag, just a minor force in German politics. But you have other right-wing groups like the German National People's Party, the Volksparty, 73 seats. Catholic Center Party, the Zinter Party, 62 seats. Communists have 54 seats. So wholesale slew of other parties with 51 seats. The largest political party in Germany in 1928 was the Social Democrats, 153 seats. But here's the problem was, Hindenburg hated the Social Democrats. And he's not going to put them in a position of authority in the German government. So it ends up bogging down, nothing gets done. For the 1930 election, Nazis score a huge breakthrough. Get 107 seats in the Reichstag. Some of the expense of these other right-wing parties. Social Democrats lose seats to the Communists. But you see what's happening here is 1930, 30, and 32 is German politics being pulled further to extremes. They're being pulled apart. First election in 1932, they had two elections that year because they couldn't figure out who was going to be running the country. You see the Nazis gaining seats on one end, Communists on the other. So, this is what you've got. Is January 1933, the Nazis had lost seats in the second election of 1932. Hitler thought his political career was over because they lost seats, thought they could never get that momentum back. But the German government is crippled. So the German vice chancellor, basically, he's the number 2 man in the Reichstag, a man named Franz von Papen. They have no chancellor. The president of Germany appoints the chancellor, basically the prime minister. Von Hindenburg said he's not going to appoint the Social Democrats. He hates Hitler. But there are no leaders of any other parties he'd even consider. Either not consider or even had the influence to even be the chancellor. Basically couldn't form a governing coalition in the Reichstag. Von Papen had been chancellor before, but he was too unpopular, so he was just stuck as vice chancellor. So Hindenburg actually considering doing what some governments in Europe had done already by this point. considering just dissolving Parliament and ruling by decree. Basically setting himself up as a dictator with emergency powers. Several countries in Europe had already done this. It wasn't long after this, after Hitler comes to power, that the American ambassador to England, Joseph P. Kennedy, said, democracy in Europe's finished. Because the 1930s it looked like it was all about to fall apart. So Hindenburg is considering ruling by decree. He's tired, he's sick, very old, doesn't have much energy. But his vice chancellor is a very cynical man. Very cynical, calculating European politician. And von Papen says, look, we got one chance to save this. That he was make Hitler chancellor. He said between the two of them, between President Hindenburg and Vice Chancellor von Papen, they could reel Hitler in. He said they could turn him into a respectable politician, get him to tone down his speeches, quit wearing those stupid uniforms, and believe that they could control him as chancellor. So reluctantly, Hindenburg agrees. In January 1933, Hitler's made chancellor of Germany. He's given power. Hitler quickly formed a weak governing coalition between his Nazi party and the Conservative National Party, set forth in his nightmarish reign. You see, the thing about fascists and dictators is they usually move with a lot of subtlety, very slowly at first. A lot of people are convinced, oh, Hitler doesn't mean what he's saying. He didn't really mean all that stuff he's saying in his campaign speeches. Those SS guys, they can't be that anti-Semitic. I mean, some of them even have Jewish girlfriends. They can't possibly mean it. Thing was, he meant every word of it. See, in your campaigning for an office like that, you say what you're going to do. See, in an atmosphere divided politics like a proportional representation system in Weimar Germany, Hitler had no reason to lie. He's going to get a lot of support no matter what he did. H.L. Mencken, the American newspaper editor, once said, if fascism ever came to America, it would come wrapped in the American flag carrying a Bible. It did the equivalent in Germany. Germany, they would have said 1920 couldn't happen here, but it did. It nearly happened in the United States. Hitler had a lot of supporters. Well, Hitler had a long publicized hatred of Jews, communists, Roman Catholics, labor unions. Once he became chancellor, he didn't stop. He assumed emergency powers, those given to previous chancellors, and started banning his opposition parties he said were a threat to the security of Germany. He banned labor unions, ending strikes but crippling a massive source of political opposition. It is basically, look at it this way, there are three ways you can overthrow a government. One, by election. If you don't like groups in power now, vote them out for a new group. In the United States, that happens every 2 years. Second, armed rebellion. But Hitler has control of the national police, the army. He has control of his own party's paramilitary group. The Nazi Party has its own army. Plus the fact they have the secret police, the Gestapo, that starts coming. They can spy on the German people. They know exactly what's going on. They have the press censored. Articles critical of the Nazi Party are quickly banned. Opposition political leaders are quickly arrested or just disappear. So how are you going to organize an armed opposition on those grounds? The Jewish population, for example, in Germany in 1939 was 210,000 out of a country of 70 million. How are they going to organize an armed resistance? When they're scattered across the country, they're being watched closely, being demonized in every corner by the government-controlled media. The question some people ask is, why didn't the Jews fight back? How were they going to? No, the third way you can overthrow government, general strike. Basically, keep the government from carrying out its instructions. Saw that communism collapsed in Eastern Europe in 1989. Basically, people went on strike, refused to carry out the government's instructions. That can overthrow a government, but Hitler just banned your labor unions. And say you're not going to be able to organize the military. I met a large group of, including old women and men and young children, and they're divided on just what to do. So a lot of Jews in Germany are saying, well, we've been through things like this before. We've seen guys like Hitler come and go. We'll be fine. Some just refuse to believe it was going to be that bad. Albert Einstein, the renowned physicist, he's living in Germany in 1933. The moment Hitler was appointed chancellor, he got on the first train out of Germany and never came back. There's a German filmmaker named Fritz Lang. Made some very famous science fiction movies in the 1920s and 30s. He made a film like that in 1934. It was critical of Hitler and the Nazi Party. Well, he's called in to the government called him inside to ask him some questions one day about this. He said, well, instead of making these kind of films, why don't you make some films about the Nazi Party, about how good it is, what it's doing for Germany? Fritz Lang sits there, quietly nods and smiles, and once he leaves that meeting, he gets on the first train and leaves Germany. Then you got the other question was, why didn't the Jews just leave? Good question, but this is their home. Why should they leave? Well, these were men who served with Kaiser in World War I. Why should they leave their homes? Sometimes they can assure themselves it's not going to be that bad. The guy can't possibly mean all that. Hitler said he's going to try to take over the world. He couldn't mean that. He's just daydreaming. Doesn't mean any of it. Couldn't possibly mean all that hatred towards the Jews. But he did. And then you got the flip side of this. A lot of reason why a lot of Jews couldn't leave Germany. Where are they going to go? How many have the money to actually pack up and move and leave to a different country? Not very many. So Hitler is doing, he's steadily dividing his opposition. Trying to have one political party, then another, because the political climate is so toxic. All these political parties don't mind their biggest competitors just been banned. Press is being censored, but it's being done very slowly, very subtly. But basically, Hitler's basically got an iron grip on all branches of government now. He controls everything. Instead of Hindenburg controlling Hitler, because of Hindenburg's declining health, it's pretty clear Hitler's controlling Hindenburg. Von Papen is just an afterthought. So he banned the largest opposition party, the Social Democrats, making the Nazis the only political party in Germany. There was a German priest in the 1930s named Friedrich Niemöller. He was originally very supportive of Hitler's rise to power because Hitler kept promising before he came to power that he's going to get rid of the communists because they're going to destroy the church in Germany. That Hitler is going to save the church, save Christianity in Germany. I gotta believe this. What happens when Hitler comes to power? He creates a thing called the National Reich Church. Basically, the government takes over the church in Germany. Preachers all have to swear loyalty to Hitler. Niemöller refuses to do this, and by 1937 he's sent to a concentration camp. When he's released after World War II, he goes around the entire world warning against the dangers of social injustice, against the dangers of extremism. And I always close with a variation on this statement. First, when they came for the Jews, but I wasn't a Jew and I didn't speak up. Then they came for the communists, but I wasn't a communist, so I didn't speak up. Then they came for the labor unions, but I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't speak up. Then they came for me, and by then there was no one left to speak for me. Hitler divided his opposition, slowly split them up. Von Papen eventually finds himself under house arrest and find his home till the fall of the Nazi regime. Others arrested, assassinated, mysterious disappearances. Others just left the country. 1934, Paul von Hindenburg dies. Hitler had the Reichstag make him both chancellor and president, basically being given full political power in Germany. Because at that point, Hitler is calling himself the Führer. New title. He had his minions burn down the Reichstag and blaming the communists sought broader powers to increase police control. Went further from there. He stripped the Jews of their citizenship. 1938, an elation became called the Kristallnacht. 1938, from German, means basically Night of the Broken Glass. Thousands of Nazi thugs, Nazi sympathizers spread out across the country, throwing rocks in the windows of Jewish stores, burning and looting Jewish communities, lynching Jews. About at least 100 Jews are killed, probably a lot more, we don't know. And after that, they began herding the Jews into the ghettos, surrounding up all the Jews, putting them in those all certain little, tiny little neighborhoods under guard, slowly moving towards his goal of exterminating all the Jews. It wasn't until the early 1940s Hitler landed on what's called the final solution, began systematically exterminating Jews and other non-German minorities. It wasn't until 1941 that they decided how exactly they're going to do it. But it wasn't just Jews, it was opposition politicians, homosexuals, gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, labor leaders, the handicapped, blind, the elderly. Basically, anybody who did not fit into Hitler's vision of what he considered to be the ideal peak human being, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed German. Of course, most noticeably, notice that Hitler had dark hair and dark eyes. Of course, you may wonder about that swastika symbol. Well, initially, that actually was a symbol of good luck, so they adopted it for that. In fact, you go to some of these stores downtown here, built in the 1920s, and you notice those little swastikas on the tile in the doorways. Why? Because in the 1920s, that was considered good luck, but Hitler so subverted the symbol of the swastika that since then has been synonymous with Nazism and evil. Why did Hitler have that goofy little mustache? That actually was the style in the 1930s in Germany. After 1945, you don't see anybody wearing it ever again. But by 1938, Hitler annexed Austria. 1936, he reoccupied the Saar and the Rhineland, moving into that opposition. And now he's moving to make alliances with others. 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia and annexed Albania in 1939. 1935, they formed the Axis Pact. It's a name that's actually devised by Mussolini. Said that one day the whole world would revolve on an axis between Berlin and Rome. 1937, they extended their alliance to include Japan, called the Tripartite Pact. So basically, those are set up your Axis powers. So in 1938, Hitler was demanding portions of Czechoslovakia, and the Allies now they're preaching the breaking. So next time we will discuss World War II in detail. So read chapters 29 and 30 in the book. If there are no questions, we'll see y'all later on.